Thanks for joining us. Once again, we've got great speakers. We've got Catriona MacDonald and Fred Mackintosh, who are candidates in the Edinburgh Southern constituency for the Scottish Parliament. Labour won it from the SNP in 2016 with a fairly slim majority, about 1100. So SNP feel they have a good chance of winning it back, while the LibDems will be hoping to recoup some of the support that they lost in 2016. The other candidates were invited, but they turned down our invitation. But we are absolutely confident that our guests will give us a good run for our money tonight. Well, it would be a run for your money if you had paid for it. It's free, by the way. But let me just start by introducing the S3U in case you're not familiar with us. I'm Morag, the convener. We're a grassroots group campaigning for independence and for Scotland to join the EU. We're not aligned to any political party. We collaborate with other grassroots groups nationally and locally, and in particular with a local group in the constituency, that is Yes Marchmont and Morningside, who are supporting our event tonight. We did a lot of street campaigning, mostly around Edinburgh, in the late summer and autumn of 2020, after the first lockdown was eased. We're now getting into campaign mode again with the imminent easing of restrictions, so you may well see us around Edinburgh over the next few weeks in the run-up to the elections. If you're not already a Yes3U member, do consider signing up via our website or by using the link, which we'll put in the chat in a minute, and I think it was also in your Eventbrite email. Look out also for our next Hustings webinar in April, and that will also be in a closely contested constituency. Our previous events are available on YouTube, and this one will be available afterwards too. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to the rest of the team. That is Sam, Leslie, Elise, David, who have really done the organising for this event. So thanks very much. Over to you, Leslie. Can you unmute, Leslie?
That is the first time that I've done that. There had to be a first. Thank you, Morag, and thank you to Fred and Catriona for coming this evening. So I'm going to start by giving a small introduction to both our candidates, and then they'll both be given 5 minutes to give a talk about what they are going to do for the constituency and what their vision is for the next Parliament. And then hopefully we'll get lots of really good questions. If you could put them into the Q&A, then that would be brilliant, and not into the chat. And then after they've had their 5 minutes, we'll go to questions, and hopefully we'll get some good discussion going. So Fred Mackintosh QC is an experienced and effective campaigner for his community. He served as Newington's councillor in Edinburgh City Council from 1999 to 2007, and after some time away from politics is standing for election both Edinburgh Southern and on the Lothian regional list in order to make sure the new Parliament puts recovery from the pandemic first. Outside politics, Fred is a highly regarded human rights lawyer at the Scottish Bar. He joined the Liberal Democrats in 1989 as a student and joined the campaign that resulted in the creation of the Scottish Parliament a decade later. In 2016, he was the count agent for Edinburgh for the official Remain campaign and the EU referendum. In May 2019, he was placed second on the Scottish Liberal Democrat list for the European elections, and he helped write the party's plan for a federal United Kingdom. Catriona is the SNP candidate for Edinburgh Southern, and before standing for Parliament, she owned and ran Jeelie Piece, a cafe and community arts centre in Tollcross. She became involved in politics through local campaigns on housing issues and land reform in her community, and remains an active member of the Tenants Union Living Rent. Catriona now sits on the board of Common Weal and is an executive member of the SNP Common Weal Group, as part of which she has successfully campaigned to introduce a national care service, nationalised rail services, and stronger tenants' rights into SNP policy. So I think that we decided that Fred was going to go first. So without further ado, we will start with Fred. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Morag, for clapping. Of course, I can't see any of you whilst being able to see my own notes, but thank you for organising this event. And obviously, Leslie has explained who I am. The Liberal Democrats, we're standing in this election on a platform that we need to put recovery from the pandemic first. And things like improving our schools, cutting waiting lists in the NHS, particularly in the area of mental health, creating more green jobs and decarbonising our homes and transport system need action. And after 14 years of a government that hasn't, in my view, delivered in those areas, they can't come after an independence referendum. Now, I do appreciate that many people on this call intend to vote leave in any future such referendum. But I'd like to try and start from a position of somewhere where we can agree. As Leslie mentioned, I was the count agent for Remain on 26th of June 2016, and I sat there up with the laptops in the rooms in Meadowbank, working out the numbers with Chris Jones from the SNP and Stuart Tooley from Labour, and we realised that we might have won here in Edinburgh, but the UK as a whole had voted to leave. Now, that loss was deeply felt. I certainly felt it deeply. I know many of you did too. But I'm a Liberal Democrat and we don't stop, so I realised we had to keep fighting. And in 2017, we campaigned for a people's vote and we eventually won the SNP round. We never won the Labour Party round until after the general election of 2019 was called. Mr. Corbyn wouldn't move. And when the Tories got their second reading for their deal, an election was the only solution. And we bet the farm, in a sense, on stopping Brexit. Sadly, those 6 million people who signed that revoke petition in the summer of 2019 chose not to back us and revoke. And you may be one of the people who did sign that, and thank you for signing it. And Boris got his majority. But I want to think back to the tempestuous days of 2019. It all feels a terribly long time ago when we used to go outside and shake people by the hand and talk to people and go to coffee shops and things. But in all those arguments, I think all of us here probably shared a lot of articles and read them about tariffs and free movement and non-tariff barriers and settled status and the Good Friday Agreement and what WTO rules mean. And we exposed the big lie at the heart of the Brexit campaign. We called out what was called cakeism, the idea that you can leave the EU, stop following its rules and have full market access. And we talked about live seafood exports and seed potatoes and financial services and the status of EU citizens in Europe and European citizens in the EU. And pointing out the problems with the Brexit project wasn't Project Fear. And we tried to explain the EU will always try and protect its single market, which we helped create. Now, I'm a lawyer, and up until December, I would say I was a European lawyer. I practice often in extradition, which is hugely influenced by European law. And the European system is one based on rules. And I like that. It's so much better than the system of conventions and rules about decent chaps will do the right thing that seem to permeate the Scottish, English and British systems. So I feel a sense of betrayal that I was taken out of the European Union. We were all union citizens. We had rights, we had opportunities, and so did our children, our friends and our neighbours, and our rights were taken away. Now there's a question in the chat already, why the LibDems will not deny you the only chance, says the questioner, that we have to return to the EU in the foreseeable future by becoming an independent country. Well, there's a reason, and the reason is this. Facts matter. The EU operates under rules, and there will be no exceptions when the single market comes around. I voted no for 2 reasons in 2014. One, because I'm Scottish and British, and I believe that there's more that unites the people of Scotland, England and Wales and Northern Ireland than divides us. And the other is that we need to think about these issues, particularly the economic effects of our decisions, on the basis of evidence. 1 minute. And so I'll add with this. The same economists who did the papers for the SNP government on the effect of Brexit on Scotland now have recently published a paper which confirms that if we leave the UK to join the European Union, after the 8, 7, 9, 10 years it will take to get there, we will be substantially poorer. There will be a hard border with Carter. That wasn't part of the 2014 plan. It shouldn't be part of any future plan. We can't make ourselves poorer. We can't ignore that as a reality. And whatever happens, if people ignore the reality of the rules, the reality of the facts, they did the same thing as Nigel Farage. We need to put the recovery first. That's what I'm standing for. That's what we believe in. And I hope you'll support us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and perfectly on time, Fred. You didn't get my alarm going off, which was excellent. So yeah, so now we go over to Catriona. If you just give me 2 minutes to reset my thing, so we're all fair and square. Right.
Very organised. I usually just yes as I'm going along.
Yeah. Oh, I know from bad experience, guessing doesn't work. That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Catriona.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me along this evening. I'm Catriona MacDonald, your SNP candidate for Edinburgh Southern in this year's Scottish Parliament election. My priority for Edinburgh Southern is a sustainable recovery from COVID-19 that puts our communities, our public services and our planet first. That means protecting our NHS. It means delivering a national care service to ensure that everyone has access to high quality care for free when they need it. It means ensuring young people and teachers are returning to school and university safely. It means providing a safe, affordable home for everyone. And it means an economic recovery that prioritises our high streets and our local businesses. The full powers of independence are crucial to building back better from the pandemic. We have an opportunity now to reframe how we run our economy and give factors like our well-being and the climate equal value to economic growth. We've seen some of that happen already in the economic response to the pandemic. There were some great ideas that we used as a response to crisis that could lay the blueprint for a better, more successful country. That is how we can build a better future for everyone who lives in Scotland. Edinburgh Southern is my home. It's where I live and work, where I went to school and where I started my family business. I've spent my career working in hospitality and tourism, two of the industries hardest hit by Brexit. As a small business owner, I had first-hand experience of the real consequences over the last 5 years of the political and economic chaos of Brexit, not only on my own business, but on our whole local economy. That's really what prompted me to get involved in parliamentary politics in the first place. I want the best for our community. We deserve better than Boris Johnson, Brexit, and another decade of austerity on top of the financial impact of the pandemic. The UK government's decision to press ahead with Brexit during the pandemic, despite the impact on businesses and jobs, was nothing short of reckless. It was a completely unnecessary, undemocratic act of economic vandalism inflicted against Scotland's will. We deserve better. We can choose a better future. And one thing for me is for sure, that future is European. The last 5 years, the SNP has fought Brexit every step of the way in both parliaments and in the courts. Despite the UK government's power grab through the Internal Markets Bill, the Scottish Government is still fighting to maintain high EU standards in devolved areas, among other things. We fought for Scotland to remain in Erasmus, the loss of which is a huge blow to our world-leading universities and our young people, especially here in Edinburgh. And we're still fighting to mitigate the worst effects of Brexit on businesses and at-risk communities across Scotland. But despite the Scottish Government's best efforts, we have been sidelined at every stage of the Brexit process. It is now beyond doubt that the only way to protect Scotland's interests and our place in Europe is to become an independent country. Scotland will become an independent member of the EU. In doing so, we'll follow in the footsteps of other successful smaller nations just like us. The only way to guarantee that Scotland will not rejoin the EU is if we do not become independent. Neither the Tories nor Labour, the two main parties at Westminster, support rejoining the EU. Here in Edinburgh, we voted by 3/4 to remain in the EU, and we have a proud internationalist history. We welcome thousands of European and international citizens who choose to make their homes here and who can all vote in May for the first time ever. We're making great steps to join the world, and it's time for us to take that place in the world as a peaceful, progressive, independent nation. The next parliamentary term is going to be defined by global challenges, like our recovery from COVID, Brexit, and the climate crisis. Independence is our opportunity to rise to these challenges. Together, let's build a better future for Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catriona. That was really good. And again, thank you for keeping to time and not having my alarm going off. So I think that Fred did touch on a question that has already come in on the chat. And if anybody else has any questions, please put them into the Q&A now. So I think that we'll go back to this question, given that Catriona didn't have a chance to touch on it at all. So the question was, the Lib Dems have always believed in the EU, and I think, Fred, you would agree that you believe in the EU. So why do you deny us the only chance we have to return to the EU in the foreseeable future by becoming an independent country? So you did touch on that in your answer, so we can go to Catriona first, and then we'll go back to you, Fred.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, I think Fred made very clear that he does support joining the EU, and I think more and more people are realising that the only way that we will rejoin the EU is as an independent nation. I know that, you know, Fred mentioned in his talk that there are challenges to joining the EU, and that's absolutely true, but we are a wealthy, successful, highly developed nation with a long track record of working within the EU and aligning with EU regulations. Our institutions in Scotland, our public institutions and even our law have developed over the last 5 decades in line with what's going on in the EU. So given the close alignment that we already have and our strong political relationships within the EU, I feel very confident that we can rejoin the EU and become a successful member state. The sooner that we become independent, the sooner that will happen. Countries quite similar to Scotland, like Sweden, Finland and Austria, completed EU accession in a couple of years. Dr. Kirsty Hughes, who is an analyst at the Scottish Centre for EU Relations, has suggested that it could be done within 1 parliamentary term. Now, I think that's very reasonable. There are challenges. We do need to overcome those challenges, but there's absolutely no reason why Scotland can't do the same as other similar nations. We'll need to meet the criteria for accession, of course, but I think there's consensus certainly that we will be able to rejoin without significant difficulty, and I look forward to Scotland rejoining the EU on those terms.
Thank you. And Fred?
You see, the problem I have, and I realise I'm in an audience for people who don't necessarily agree with me, is that everything Catriona said, her warm words, her aspirations, her, of course it's going to be fine, look at that expert. It's all the same. We've got the institutions, we can do it, it'll be no problem at all, is exactly the same line that was used by the Brexiteers in the run-up to 2016. It's the exact same approach, because this is the important point. I don't believe the First Minister wants to join the European Union. I don't believe the SNP leadership do. And the reason I don't believe that is because they haven't published any research that explains why they will meet all the chapters of the Copenhagen criteria. They haven't explained that. If they'd done that, we could read it, we could understand it. We could understand, for example, how a country without its own currency, which is what the SNP proposed, could meet the fiscal requirements of Chapter 17. Now, Catriona's shaking her head. She and I can have an argument, and I'm sure other people can join in about our own opinions on this. But the Scottish Government have been in power for 14 years, and it's been 5 terrible years since the Brexit vote. If the SNP genuinely wanted to demonstrate the truth of this matter, rather than enabling us to quote experts back at each other, which is what we can do, they would have done that. Now, to answer the question that Vivian's asked, I don't support an independent Scotland joining the European Union for the quite good reason that I don't support an independent Scotland. And I'm not going to make the mistake that David Cameron made of having a referendum on something I don't support. I look at the horrible experience of European Union citizens who have their identity changed, who can't get their residence, who worry about whether they're foreign in a state that was within their union, and I ask this question: why should I inflict that on another group of people? Why should I give up one of my identities when I've already had one ripped off me? Because multiple identities is the European idea, and people in this country are Scottish and British and European. And putting out one border is a really bad idea. It's a terrible idea. We all opposed it. Giving in to another bunch of nationalists and putting up another border to make more people divided from their families and to create more economic hardship is a very bad idea. Now, I don't expect you to agree with me, but you did invite me here. And if you hadn't invited me here, this would have been an SNP election expense event. So that's why I don't support it. I don't want to be sundered from my kith, kin, friends and neighbours. And that's why I'm not going to support it.
I think we can allow Catriona to come back if you would like, just to take up a couple of the points that Fred had made.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the framing of Scotland and the EU is quite important. I mean, it's not the case that we're making the same arguments as was made in the Brexit referendum, because there the UK government was saying, well, we don't have any institutions except those that are within the EU already, but it'll be fine. We can create some new ones. We can create new trade deals. We can create a completely new system out with the EU after almost 50 years within the EU. In Scotland, we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to rejoin the EU. We're trying to remain part of the institutions that we have created as part of the EU. And we're trying to remain part of that trading bloc with the strong relationships with our neighbours that we have. Now, I think it is perfectly reasonable for people who live in Scotland, people who have family, like me, have family or friends in England, who have strong connection to England, to feel British and to feel Scottish. And I don't for one second think that it would be beneficial to Scotland to have a poor relationship with England, or a negative or conflicted relationship with England. I think that it is in the interests of both Scotland and the rest of the UK that when Scotland becomes independent, we maintain strong trading relationships within our obligations under the EU. We maintain the strong services industry that we have, for example, and we maintain the common travel area to allow people in Scotland to continue to have the relationships with England that they used to have. I don't see that as being divisive. I see that as Scotland taking its own choices, going its own way, but still maintaining good relationships with its neighbours, as I hope every independent country would want to do.
Thank you. I think, yeah, both candidates have made their points on that. So I think we can move on to the next question. Do you have a question, David, from the ones that came in before?
So just for participants' benefit, many people submitted questions in advance. We have those to hand. You're more than welcome to submit questions in the Q&A. Please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, because the chat just flies up the screen too quickly. So and also we're able to keep a track of what's been dealt with and answered in the Q&A. So please, if you've got a question, put it in the Q&A. So one of the pre-submitted questions was, are we doing enough to avert the climate catastrophe? If not, what should we be doing? And let's reverse the order on this. So Fred, perhaps you could go first.
Right. No, we're not. I seem to remember at the election in 2019, the parties that didn't win, so that's Labour, Liberal Democrats, the SNP, Plaid, and the Greens, both Green parties, suggested a faster rate to achieve zero carbon in the UK than the Conservatives. To be fair, the Conservatives actually suggested a target that was faster than before, so I suppose that's slightly positive. But I think we need to focus what's in front of us, which is the Scottish Parliament election, and what the Scottish Parliament can influence. So the Scottish Parliament, with its current powers, which were set up in the 90s and expanded as a result of work by the Liberal Democrats, can deal with a lot of work on decarbonising domestic heating and insulating property and decarbonising the transport system. And so I'm really pleased that Catriona was able to persuade the SNP National Party to be in favour of nationalising ScotRail, which is good because the SNP government failed to nationalise ScotRail the last time round. It had an opportunity to do so. And so I think what we need to do is use the powers we've got. And I think for all of us, I'm looking around the panel, and I'm not going to pick anybody, but we all live in conventional Scottish houses, which are expensive to heat and sometimes difficult to insulate. And that requires work. It requires a government that's going to engage and spend the money that it does exist. And if any of you have ever tried to engage with the wonderfully helpful people of the Energy Saving Trust, it's still really difficult. The take-up of loans and grants is really low. We can use the powers of the Parliament to address the problem on heating. We can use the powers of the Parliament to address the issue of transport. We could reduce the number of new motorways being built, new roads being built, for example, invest more money in rail. So there are things that can be done within the powers of the Parliament, and more things need to be done. They'll be easier to do if we aren't creating a new country in the middle of the process. They'll be easier to do if we aren't in accession negotiations for the EU separate for the rest of the UK. That's just a reality. Because we've just criticised the UK government correctly for wasting 5 years on leaving negotiations. So let's not waste 5 years or more, whatever the number is, no one's told us yet, in creating a new country and then joining. Let's instead remember what happened in the 90s. Some of us here are old enough to remember 92, when the late Tories got back in. The SNP said we can be free by 93. The majority of Scotland, however, realised we could create the coalition to get the Tories out and change things, and we created the Parliament. Let's do that again. It'll be quicker, it'll be less painful, and we'll be able to deal with climate change.
Yes, so the short answer to your question is no, we're not doing enough to tackle the climate crisis. The climate crisis is the biggest emergency that we are facing. It's bigger than the pandemic, it is bigger than Brexit, it's bigger than Scotland's future, because it is the future of our world. Yes, we absolutely need to make sure that in the next Parliament, which scientists have said is our very last chance to take action, that we put the climate emergency at the centre of everything we do. And what I mean by that is that we need to completely restructure how we look at our economy. Individual policies, like for example, planting 22 million trees, which is fantastic, are a really important part of that, but they have to be part of a bigger strategy. We need to put sustainability at the heart of our economy. Now, as Fred mentioned, I have been campaigning for nationalised rail, and I would like to see nationalised public transport across the board, because one of the things that we can do as individuals is to get out of our cars and stop creating pollution in that way. If we're going to hit our targets or even exceed our targets, as we must do for reducing carbon emissions, then these are the kind of actions that we need to take. But these are structural actions. Individual people can't do them by themselves. So policies like nationalising public transport, creating free public transport. We now have free public transport, or we will have free public transport for everyone under the age of 22, as well as older people. And creating, for example, a national energy company to invest in Scotland's renewables. In the past, oil and gas were very strong economic choices for Scotland. But in the future, we can use the expertise and the skills built up by that industry over the decades to invest in renewables, to invest in new technology. And Scotland is already leading the world in its response to the climate crisis. We need to continue that. We need to be innovative. We need to be focused on making sure that everything that we do is centred around preserving the future of our planet. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise anyone here to hear me say that in order to do that, in order to restructure our economy in that way, we need the full financial powers of independence. That's why independence is important, not as an end in itself, but as a means to creating the kind of country that we want to live in, and the kind of country that every country should be striving to become. So yes, we need to do more in the climate crisis. And I think that to link it back to what we're talking about this evening, the EU, I'm really concerned about the backsliding on environmental standards that the Tories have indicated that they will be moving towards. And I think we can all unite to prevent that happening, and to prevent the high environmental standards of the European Union being phased out of our domestic legislation.
Thank you. I think we'll go to a new question from the chat now. So this is from Jonathan, and it's to both candidates. So it's while fewer people have died of COVID per capita than fewer people in Scotland have died of COVID per capita than in England, we still have a very poor death rate from the pandemic. He says, I'd be really jealous of my colleagues in New Zealand and South Korea, where they have almost no restrictions within their borders. Fred, what would your what would your party have done differently if in power? And Catriona, what would an Indie Scotland have done differently? So we can start that one. Maybe Catriona can start that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a really good question. I have perhaps a slightly unusual perspective on this. When I was a kid, I moved to China with my family in 2004, just at the tail end of the SARS epidemic. So a lot of the measures that we have started taking in the last year, like face coverings, like social distancing, are things that I'd already come across before. And these are things that work. You know, a strong test and trace regime, public compliance with things like face coverings and social distancing, these really do work. And I think it's fantastic that we're rolling out the vaccine so quickly, because the vaccine is the only thing that can end the pandemic. But In terms of what an independent Scotland would have done differently, I think the First Minister has said herself that one thing that she would have liked to have done differently would have been to lock down earlier. And across the world, we saw where there was an early lockdown that helped to prevent the spread much more quickly, and it meant that we could come out of lockdown much more quickly. But the thing that stopped us from doing that was the economic impact of doing so. So closing businesses, we can only close businesses if we're able to give business owners and workers the financial security to be able to cope during that period of closure. And if we're asking people not to go to work, especially people working who are in low income jobs or perhaps in precarious work, then we need to be able to give them the financial security to do that. The Scottish Government has rolled out a package of support to businesses, which has been effective. And, obviously a lot of my former colleagues in small businesses have benefited from that and have been able to keep staff on and to keep their businesses ticking over. I was really pleased in the last couple of weeks that Edinburgh City Council is looking at measures to remove licence fees to help businesses get back on their feet, and also that the Scottish Government listened to businesses and put in place a restart grant, which is what businesses had asked for because of the costs of reopening. So I suppose what an independent Scotland could have done differently would have been to have full control of those financial powers from the start, to give people that kind of security to allow us to take effective measures. And the other thing that is absolutely crucial would have been, and still is, border control. If we had control of our borders, we would have been able to implement better checks on people coming into the country. By that I mean quarantining and testing. As you mentioned South Korea in the question, in South Korea they had a system almost immediately whereby everyone arriving in South Korea was tested at the airport, was put into quarantine until they had the result of the test, and then was tested again after leaving quarantine, just to be extra sure. That is a game changer, and that is one of the things that has kept the COVID incidence in South Korea so low. So those are, I suppose, are the main things: borders, the economic support, and the power to lock down. Those would be the main things I would have liked to see in a really effective response to the pandemic.
Thank you. And what would your, if the LibDems had been in power, what do you think that you might have been able to, or you would have done differently?
I think the first thing to say is that hindsight's a marvellous thing. And there are three things that I point out in respect to what the Scottish Government did, and it is a Scottish Parliamentary election. Firstly, we mustn't forget the Nike conference and the failure to report the incident to the UK, to not tell anybody, to contract trace people who had been engaging with Nike conference attendees who caught COVID because of that. We also mustn't forget that was before lockdown. So if the SNP government was really keen on acting, they didn't act then. On borders, Joanna Cherry MP and Ben Macpherson, who's the Minister for External Affairs in the Scottish Government, both spent most of March and April telling people the Scottish Government didn't have the power to quarantine at airports. It then was, of course, exposed by those of us who can actually read the legislation that it had the entire time that power. Now, you can get into an argument of whether it had the money. I absolutely accept that. But there's always a lobbying process you can do to get more money. And the UK government has been throwing money around like a drunken sailor. So I think getting money might have been possible. But the Scottish government always had the power to quarantine at airports. I accept it didn't have the power to quarantine at the border of the rest of the UK. It just chose not to use it because the power is in the Act. It's a Scottish Act. It's entirely devolved. And the main thing I'd say is a Scottish Parliament, if we'd been independent in 2014, we would be currently trying to manage our deficit, which is running at 9%, which is compared to the UK is much higher than the whole of the UK because we get more money to spend than people south of the border do. We do well out of the Union. And in Europe, we have a high deficit. If we joined the European Union, like Croatia, we'd have gone into a negotiated process to reduce our deficit to below 3%. So there would have been less money. At the end of the day, I remember the care homes. Think about the death rate in care homes in Scotland. It was the worst in the first lockdown, first peak, in the world. That was entirely the Scottish Government's responsibility. Their fault, their watch. Now, what will we have done differently? I hope we'd have done better, but you can't run hindsight on these things. What you can do is look forward. We think that the Coronavirus Act shouldn't be continued. We should have proper separate legislation on individual elements of it, because this controlling legislation without debate, which happens both much worse down south, but certainly in Scotland, is not the way to manage lockdowns in the future. We have to have much tighter legislation that focuses on making lockdowns work properly if they're required again. We shouldn't, for example, have tried to abolish jury trials, what the SNP did. We shouldn't have done what they did to freedom of information, to block scrutiny. That's what the health minister was seemingly engaged in, not worrying about care homes. And ultimately, I don't think we should be taking lectures from China on social cohesion and following rules. We should do this. We should have had a government that give good examples. Of course, that all went out the window when people drove to Barnard Castle and Margaret Ferrier came to Scotland on the train. But we really should have worked on delivering by example. It could have been better. It could be better in the future, but ultimately we'll be poorer if we're independent for the first decade or so, possibly longer. It would have been harder if Yes had won in 2014. I'm not just saying that, it's what I believe.
Okay, thanks. Let's go for one of the other questions submitted in advance then. So, will you accept a pro-Indy majority as a mandate for Indy Ref 2? If not, how can you deny democracy? And I think it's Fred's turn to go.
Yeah, this is a very easy question to ask. So I'm a Liberal Democrat candidate. We don't think there should be a referendum. And if people want there to be a referendum, they should vote for one of the parties that do. They should vote for the new Alex Salmond party, or the SNP, or the Greens. If you don't want a referendum and you vote for me, I will comply with that mandate, and I will vote in the Parliament against having a referendum. Now, if on the other hand, those other three parties acquire a majority and are prepared to work together and they can get it through, well, that's in a sense fine. That's what democracy is. But I've made a commitment and I will stick to it. And that's the point. And that's why we had revoke. If there'd been a majority of Liberal Democrats, it would have been terribly exciting, but we could have revoked because that's what we voted for. So I'm not going to vote for an independence referendum. That's my commitment, and that's what I'll do.
Catriona?
That's kind of an easy question for me. Yes, I would accept a pro-independence majority. It's what I'm campaigning for, and I would hope to see that happen in the next Parliament.
Okay, thank you. The Edinburgh economy is based on financial services, banking and life insurance, education, 4 universities, and professional services, law, actuarial, consulting, and others. What would you do as an MSP to ameliorate the impact of Brexit on these sectors? And that was submitted in advance, but I noticed something came flying through the chat very quickly about the current funding model for universities being broken, not working really with the loss of Erasmus and so on. I think it's Catriona's turn to go first.
Sorry, there was just a wee connection problem just at the start of that question. You said about, I heard the question, what would we do to protect financial services and education? Was that it?
Yeah, let me repeat that. So the Edinburgh economy is based on financial services, banking and life insurance, education, 4 universities, and professional services, law, actuarial, consulting, and others. What would you do as an MSP to ameliorate the impact of Brexit on these sectors?
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, absolutely. The loss of our EU membership and particularly the loss of freedom of movements is a huge blow to these industries. I'll pick up education first as well, because I also spotted the other question about that. The fact of us being able to exchange students, exchange expertise and exchange teaching staff with the rest of the EU has been an incredible benefit to our universities. That being lost in combination with the impact of the pandemic, where fewer, it seems, we don't know yet, but it seems as if fewer international students have been enrolling in our universities in Edinburgh. And we've not been able to have people coming across to Scotland has had a really negative impact. Now, one of the things, the most obvious thing that we can do to mitigate that impact is to invest in the recovery of our higher education sector. The Scottish Government has put £45 million of funding into recovery for the education sector. And I think that the priority for that will be to protect research and development and also to protect teaching staff. And I know that Edinburgh University is providing practical support for teaching staff who might be affected by Brexit. These are small things, but they are really, really important. In terms of financial services and the services industry in general, again, freedom of movement is a huge loss to these industries. I think what we need to see in the next few years is an economic recovery that puts our city centres and our high streets first. So we've seen huge changes to the way that we work over the last year, and we need to make sure that we're not losing jobs from Edinburgh as a result of Brexit. And that's exacerbated because people know that they can now work from home. I mean, if you've been to the city centre recently, if you've been to the area around Morrison Street and where there are the sort of main headquarters of a lot of financial services industry, it's empty, and that's having a serious impact on local businesses that rely on these offices. So again, we need investment in the industry to protect the jobs that are already there, and we need to be providing a strong partnership to international partners who would want to set up headquarters or set up offices, or maintain the offices that they already have here in Edinburgh. And ultimately, I think rejoining the EU would be a significant step forward for both of these things. Rejoining Erasmus, rejoining our educational and research partnerships with the rest of the EU in order to protect what we have in Scotland and continue to lead the world in developing and research through our education sector.
Right. Really good question, because I think I've got the figures from the LSE, or the Institute of Government last week. So Scotland's financial services sector and insurance is worth £13.7 billion in exports, of which over 80% are to the rest of the UK. So the first thing that I would do was not jeopardise that export. Because if we join the European Union independent of the rest of the UK, and I don't believe in giving up, I'll come back to why I don't believe in giving up in a moment, then we're going to put that at jeopardy, because there's no services agreement between the UK and the EU. So we don't want to be in a position where our financial services sector, all those jobs move south because we're floating a new currency or we're sterlingizing or something like that. That's the harm. Now, obviously, there's a huge problem with offices, because offices are now being unused because we're all on Zoom. Offices, you talk to people in financial services and professional services firms and law firms, and they're getting rid of their offices because they realize people can work at home and it's cheaper, and people like working at home because they haven't got a commute. And we have to reinvent our cities. It's going to cost time, it's going to cost money, it's going to cost a lot of debate. Just think of the argument over spaces for people in Edinburgh. Imagine doing the same thing about reinventing the whole of our city centre with more housing in order to change the way it works so that we can keep the economic vibrancy. All of that will be harder if we create the distraction, and I mean that genuinely, of independence. Now I want to tell you a story about Bill Cash. There is, I'm sure, none of us on this call who agree with Bill Cash. I think we can all agree about that. In 1990, I was a student at Edinburgh, and I was the macer of the debates committee. It was a very weird debates committee, and I remember chairing or controlling, there was a chair, so controlling a debate. Bill Cash turned up. It was on Europe. And people were saying to him, but the referendum was years ago, because it was in the 70s. And Bill Cash said, yeah, I understood, accept it. I'll keep trying. And he did. And he succeeded. So we'll keep trying. And that's my argument to everybody on here who's accused me of blocking your way to the European Union. We win the argument. We've done it before. We'll do it again. This is a deeply incompetent, useless Conservative government. Labour is ahead in the seats they lost 2 years ago. They will lose. We can beat them. Despairing and going down the nationalist route, putting up more borders, making our friends and neighbours foreigners in their own country, that's never going to be the answer.
Thank you. We're going to go to a question about the internal market bill, because I think this is really important. Obviously, Fred doesn't agree with independence, but I would presume you do agree with a devolved government in Edinburgh, and you believe that we should have devolved powers. So the internal market bill, as the person says, Florence Sinclair, I'm extremely concerned about the internal market bill, particularly the power of veto that Westminster has. We only have to look at the contempt that has been shown to Scotland during the Brexit negotiations to realise that we must have been independent to make the decisions that are pertinent to Scotland, and Westminster will always put England first. Now, obviously, we realise, Fred, that you don't agree with independence. We won't take this back to another "I don't agree with independence" answer, because that's not getting us anywhere. So you don't agree with independence. So how do we tackle these things as they stand? The powers that people in Scotland voted for are being taken away by Westminster. And there's also questions about democracy. So how would you go about tackling them? And I can say the same question, I'll ask the same question to Catriona as well.
So, I mean, I think it's important to understand where I come from on this one. So I joined the Liberal Democrats to campaign for Scottish Parliament. I was the treasurer of the rally for the recall to recall the previous Parliament. It was done slightly light in a touch, but it was one of the campaign vehicles we used in the run-up to 1997. I deeply support the idea of Scottish Parliament. I campaigned for it. It would be a great honour to be elected to it. I'm also one of the authors of the Liberal Democrat policy on a federal UK Home Rule and a federal United Kingdom. Our original policy, which predates me, was a huge part of the detail of the convention scheme. That idea of a parliament that worked collectively, that was positive, that hadn't got committees run by the party bosses, where the ministers treated Parliament with respect, where Parliament led. That's what I want to get back to. In the coalition years, which of course weren't good for the Liberal Democrats, we did a few good things. And one of the good things we did is we increased the powers of the Scottish Parliament. But we weren't able to win one argument. We lost a particular argument. In the Scotland Act, it says that the Westminster Parliament will not normally legislate in Westminster in devolved matters. The word normally is in there. And in the case about the Scottish Brexit bill, the Supreme Court said, well, that's the problem. They do retain the power, and they do retain the power because of that ridiculous concept of parliamentary sovereignty. We need to break that, and we need a federal UK to do it. And what's really interesting is in the last year or so, we've seen figures in the Labour Party begin to realise, figures in England begin to realise, and the pandemic particularly has shown that in England, the cities, you saw Andy Burnham arguing about lockdown support in the summer of last year. The cities in England have realised they need more power. And I think there is a movement that will build over this Parliament to create a federal UK, and that will solve the problem. So in the meantime, yes, the internal market bill is an outrage. We always needed some form of internal market bill structure. We had one in Europe. It just needed to be one that was accountable. We needed one that involved all the governments and all the mayors and all the different parts of England all together. It would be quite good if Parliament was elected by the majority of the people, not by a minority. Be a pretty good idea if there was elections to the House of Lords, but for some reason Labour blocked that in 2012. So yes, we need to make these changes. Yes, the internal market bill is an abomination, but we're not going to burn the house down because we don't like it. We can change, we can win elections, because Free by 1993 was a ridiculous campaign, and the same argument applies now. Let's work together across parties and reform the UK. Then we haven't got the pain and the anguish and the stress. And our really powerful Parliament can deliver the things that we all want delivered, because we need to put recovery first, rather than having another decade of constitutional negotiations, which I don't think we're going to be able to be up for.
Thank you. Catriona, a similar question, because obviously we're not going to be independent tomorrow, and we're not going to be in the EU tomorrow. So how do we move forward on the internal market bill? Obviously what Fred said was interesting and a positive response in terms of how you can do that long term, but how, short term, how do we tackle this?
Well, that's a really good question, a really difficult question. I'm really pleased to hear that Fred agrees that the internal markets bill is a democratic outrage. Unfortunately, it's not the kind of thing that we can just elect parliamentarians to oppose, because of course we did elect our Scottish Parliament, who refused consent for it, and the UK government went ahead anyway. And of course we did elect a majority of SNP MPs who opposed it in Westminster, and the UK government went ahead anyway. So in terms of what we, the people, can do from a democratic perspective, we're very limited, and we have clearly tried to oppose it in Parliament, in both parliaments, as far as we possibly could. The Scottish Government has pursued a strategy since Brexit became a reality, essentially, of trying to limit the UK government's power to draw us away from the EU as far as the devolved settlement allows. But as Fred also pointed out, the devolved settlement limits us very significantly. I think that what we can do is we can pursue quite a bold strategy. We can push the limits of devolution, but the terms of the Scotland Act are such that we cannot legislate on areas that are beyond the Scottish Parliament's competence, and the Internal Market Bill has the power to override devolved legislation. That's what the House of Lords said, and I'm not usually one to quote the House of Lords. It's a democratic outrage not dissimilar to the Internal Markets Bill, but their constitutional committee said that it would limit the scope for devolved administrations to pursue policy diversion. And that's really important on issues like the environment, on issues like agriculture, on food standards, and on climate change. And, you know, the Scottish Government wants to pursue different strategies to the UK government, particularly on climate change. So it is possibly something that there is no short-term solution to. We have attempted the short-term solutions of stopping the bill, and now we need to accept that it exists and work to deliver independence so that we don't have to continue to live under the limitations of devolution.
Thank you. Do you have questions, David?
Sure. I have one very relevant to the constituency about the Princess Alexandra Eye Pavilion. So the Scottish Government has said it will not now replace the Princess Alexandra Eye Pavilion with a new centre at the Royal Infirmary. Edinburgh people in need of treatment for eye conditions will have to travel for an hour or more on public transport to St John's in Livingston. Many of them are elderly. Edinburgh, the capital, will be the only major Scottish city without a specialist eye hospital. The government have apparently delayed the final decision. Will you lobby for a replacement for the eye pavilion? And who went? I think it's Catriona goes first on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is probably one where everyone running for Parliament in Edinburgh can agree on. We have to protect eye care services in Edinburgh. This is one of the issues that's come up at every hustings. I've had loads of emails from people who've been going to the eye pavilion for years, and I think we all really value its services. In the short term, Kate Forbes has said she's going to double maintenance spend in order to allow the IHOP pavilion to remain open, but it is an old building and it does need to be replaced. Since the plans were put in place for the site at the Royal Infirmary, what we need from an eye hospital has changed, but the fact that we need an eye hospital here in Edinburgh has not changed. So what's happening now is that NHS Lothian is carrying out a review of eye care services to consider how best they can be delivered. But I don't think any of us would want to see Edinburgh lose its eye care services. The SNP Council leader, Adam McVeigh, wrote jointly with all the other party leaders to the Health Secretary to ask to be able to discuss this and to discuss the possibility of having a replacement eye hospital built at the Royal Infirmary site where it was originally intended to be. And separately, but as part of that, I think we also need to make sure that what we've learned during the pandemic is taken on board. So during the pandemic, thousands of people who have long-term eye conditions are being reviewed closer to home for the first time ever in community optometrists. Now, this has taken the pressure off eye care services, centralised eye care services, and I think that that's a good thing. You know, we're now, the NHS Lothian are now supporting a pilot scheme to allow people with lower risk long-term conditions to receive their treatment closer to home, and that helps in making decisions about what the future of the eye hospital in Edinburgh will look like. So I'm sure, I feel quite confident that Fred will agree that this is something that we need to protect, and I hope that in the next Parliament the funding will be secured and the political consensus and cooperation will be secured to protect the essential eye care services we have in Edinburgh.
Thank you. I suppose it's entirely possible that Catriona and I could be in the Parliament together, considering I'm running on the list. So I'll be really interested to see, Catriona, if you maintain that line at Holyrood, because a contractor was appointed to design that hospital, that new eye pavilion. That contractor was appointed less than 2 years ago. The idea that the nature of eye treatment has changed in 2 years ago is ridiculous. And so whoever told you that is wrong. It's a capital city. We've just told us how we can be an independent country and we're not going to have an eye hospital? That's ridiculous. What we have here, and we have again, and it does my head in because we thought we got rid of it with Tony Blair's government, is the pretending that you're not in power. The SNP have been in power for 14 years. If the eye pavilion isn't there, if it took 2 years longer than it ought to have sick kids, be responsible for it. And a few people have pointed out Liberal Democrat failings in the chat. I accept them. We were in power for 5 years. When we were in power for the first 2 years of this parliament, we did a lot of good, made a few mistakes. We take responsibility. We need an eye pavilion. We need an NHS Lothian that's actually competent. And it isn't. Our health service is not well run. It's not run by clinicians. It's not got good targets. It's run to avoid problems. That's why so many people died in care homes. So I think we really need to focus on this. All the parties are saying they will deliver this, except weirdly, so are the people who actually are stopping it happening, which is the SNP. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't expecting this one to be a contentious one, but as it is, Catriona, do you want to come back?
I suppose I would just say that, just repeat what I said before, that I think we should really be working together to deliver this. The SNP council leader, the SNP group in the city council have supported maintaining the eye pavilion, or rebuilding the eye pavilion rather. And sometimes local government and centralised government have different views, and then local government makes the case for what we need in our local area, and I would expect local MSPs to do the same. And there is a possibility that Fred and I will both be in Parliament next year. And previously at Hustings, when this has been brought up, there was again consensus from MSPs that this is something that, candidates rather, that this is something that we need for our local area. I think if you want to be an effective parliamentarian, you have to represent your local area, not just your government, and that's what I would intend to do when elected.
Okay.
Thank you. I think that this is quite a nice question that we'll maybe finish on. It's about working together. So it says, Alan Crosby put in, hi both, good to see you. If a future Indie ref did not go your way, would you, Fred, put your skills and efforts towards getting the best for an independent Scotland? And would you, Catriona, do the same towards achieving full federal powers? If not, what would you do? And we'll go to Fred first for that one.
Of course. So when the referendum was going a bit dicey the weeks before 2014, of course I thought about that. And of course I would. That would be a ridiculous thing not to do. But 2014, we keep going. There'll be a referendum. I would be delighted to hear Catriona to say that if the next referendum happens and the SNP lose, she won't campaign for another one. I'm going to be sceptical about that. But I will work with anybody who wants to create a federal UK, anytime, any place. Please get in touch.
Catriona?
I suppose I can answer this one from experience, because I obviously did campaign for independence in 2014 and it didn't go my way. I was one of thousands of teenagers across Scotland who became involved in the referendum as our kind of first foray into getting involved in politics. And for me, it was the trigger to me becoming more involved in community activism and to becoming more involved in changing things for my community. Because I felt in 2014, when the referendum didn't happen, of course I felt disappointed, and of course I felt that the wrong decision, we'd come to the wrong decision. But I also felt that we couldn't let that energy dissipate. We couldn't let all of the engagement, all of the ideas, all of the amazing participation that we had, especially from young people like me, go to waste. So that was why I got involved with Common Weal. And one of the things that we've done at Common Weal is we've recognised that, yes, we want to be an independent nation, But until we are an independent nation, we can't just occupy ourselves with campaigning for independence. We also have to lay the groundwork for the kind of country that we want to see. Now, when we started the SNP Common Weal Group, it was on that same principle that yes, we're campaigning for independence, and yes, we're making plans for the kind of country we want to build after independence. But in the meantime, we need to push devolution to its limits. Where we find those limits, we need to try to overcome them. And we need to put in place policies using the powers that we already have. The examples of that are the National Care Service that we successfully campaigned for, that people in Scotland support overwhelmingly. We've got other policies like that. We've got other ideas for how we could run Scotland now to prepare us, to make us more resilient, so that when we become independent, we're starting off on a strong footing and we can start putting in place all the ideas that we couldn't do without those powers. I'm interested in the concept of federalism. I would certainly never object to federalism. I would certainly never object to further devolution of powers to the Scottish Government and from the Scottish Government to local authorities. I think that that's always a good thing. And if we do not succeed in the next referendum on independence, then certainly I would continue to work for further devolution and for using the powers that we have to their fullest extent.
I had my COVID vaccine today, so I blame that. So yes, I think that that's us done an hour now, and we've answered the questions very well. So I'm going to hand back to Morag, who's going to say a few words, and then Pete from Yes, Morningside and Marchmont is going to say something as well. So over to you, Morag.
Hi, I just want to say thanks very much. That was, that was fantastic. Debate, really good range of questions came in as well, and really good to hear often your very contrasting views. So it's really interesting and very helpful, I think, for for voters, for constituents, to get that opportunity to hear from you. So thanks very much for that. Now I'm just going to very quickly pass over to Peter Winfield, who is from Yes, Marchmont and Morningside. He just wants to say a few words. And as I said earlier, we collaborate with that group. So there you go, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much, Morag. Well, I would just like to join and thank you both very much for turning up. I think it was a very interesting, very enjoyable evening, and to hear your contrasting views about what we might do and the way forward. And I think I particularly want to thank you, Fred, for coming along, because of course we are advocates. We both of us are advocates for independence, and so we're not neutral. And I didn't think it was very easy to ask anyone to come along into what you might consider to be a lion's den. So I think it was a very interesting and very informative evening. Thank you both.
Oh, thanks, Pete. So all that remains for me to do now is to say thank you ever so much. Watch this space for our next Hustings webinar. Go to our website, have a look, get more information if you like. And I just want to say thanks very much to the speakers. Thanks very much to our participants and your questions in particular. So thank you.